So we're going to change gears a little bit, and we're still going to be talking about the same general topic, but I'm going to approach things from a little bit different standpoint. I think that hopefully you'll see this, and I'll try to point it out over the next few lessons, why we did it in the order we did, and why the first part is important for the second part. Right? But we are still on the external sorts of things. We're not getting into the Bible's evidences yet. That's still a ways down the road. But I'm not following this book, and I'll mention here in a minute. But there is a book that I read after I had studied this for a while that lays some of these things out. I'm going to talk about lays them out actually pretty good. So we're going to use some of his material as we go along here, and hopefully get into several different topics. Today we're going to cover one that is kind of independent. It has come up in one of the videos, I think, so far, but we are going to kind of do it in detail. But before we do that, I'm going to use an example of what would seemingly be a good piece of evidence or series of evidence that leads to a wrong conclusion. Because I think that's what's happening a lot of times in this next part, is that there is what seemingly is very good evidence for a certain conclusion, but if you look at it a different way, the conclusion can be reached totally different. So, are there examples of that you can think of? You don't have to say them if you don't want to, or you could if you do want to. Of a time when you or someone else saw something or heard something or was told about something that happened, and everybody thought it was one way, but it turned out that the evidence really didn't point in that direction. Anybody want to share one? You don't have to, but I mean, if you want to. I've got one that's a true story, not about me, that was in a book that we're going to talk about later on. You got one that you want to share? You kind of, but you know that it's happened, right? You got one?
I got one.
Short. Good.
Short. Here it is. Luke, I am your father. Darth Vader never says it. He never said it. Everybody was convinced that he said it. And then it came out, no, he actually said it.
Now, I was thinking about something in real life, but
Sure.
no. It's an example. Absolutely. All right? So, possibilities for getting a wrong conclusion. Misleading theories. All right? If an initial theory is wrong, and you follow it thinking that it is correct, and that it's the only possibility, that the conclusions you reach are going to be wrong. I remember one time in a math class in college, geometry, the first day, the math professor got up and he started doing a proof on the board, just right out of the gun. Didn't introduce himself or anything. And we're talking about two huge blackboards, and by the end, he had it all filled up. And ended up in the end, he had supposedly proved that a obtuse angle was equal to an acute angle. Now, I don't know if you remember what those terms are, but an obtuse angle is bigger than 90 degrees, and an acute angle is less than 90 degrees. So he had proved like a 30-degree angle could be equal to a 135-degree angle. But in general, he had done it for all angles that way. Was there anything misleading in the proof? Absolutely. And once he had pointed out that he had proved that, I looked through and I actually found where his flaw was. There was misleading information in the proof. That kind of embedded on my mind that if you're not really looking at an argument, you can be misled. All right? Second one, contamination of forensic evidence. The kind of evidence, this kind of evidence is misleading due to honest errors that are made, not looking at the right pieces or incomplete facts. false evidence. Sometimes there's evidence that just wasn't true from the very beginning. Sometimes intentionally misleading people, and out and out lies. All right. And finally, incomplete evidence. There can be times when evidence there just wasn't enough facts there to show what was going on for sure, and that led people to believe things in a wrong way. So I'm going to do the following. I'm going to ask you guys what is wrong with the verdict in this particular case as I read down through it. All right. So here it goes. This comes from an actual person, Lee Strobel. Some of you may have read any of his books. This comes from the beginning of a book called Case for Christ. He started out as an atheist, trying to prove to his wife that she was stupid for believing in Christianity. He approaches each of the chapters like he was in a court case, covering it like a law person would with only the facts. All right, and this is the beginning example that he uses why sometimes facts are misleading. The story here, just to give you a summary before I start reading it, is about a guy that supposedly shot a police officer after he responded to a call that he was trying to hurt a lady inside the house. He starts out like this. A neighbor called the police to report a man with a gun. Police Sergeant Richard Scallon rushed to the scene and found a man named James Dixon arguing with his girlfriend in the doorway. The girl's father came out of the house when he saw the policeman. A fight broke out between the girl's father and Dixon. The policeman tried to break it up, and then the policeman was shot and staggered away and he was wounded. Just then, 2 other squad cars arrived and immediately arrested Dixon. The police searched the premises and found a .22 caliber gun with 1 bullet fired. The gun had Dixon's fingerprints on it. It was also registered to Dixon. Upon further investigation, it was found that Dixon had a rap sheet, and among other things, he had previously been convicted for shooting someone. Okay? You know, at this point, what would you think? Right? Okay? Luckily, the policeman's wounds were not threatening, but the case against Dixon seemed ironclad, and he was convicted and sentenced to prisons. 2 weeks later, this is the guy that wrote the book, Case for Christ. Strobel, who, by the way, was an award-winning law journalist in the Chicago Tribune, had been covering that case, and he got a phone call from an informant. It seems that a piece of important information had been overlooked in the trial. The police officer, Scallion, was known to have owned a .22 caliber pen gun. You know what a pen gun is? It's the same size as a pen, looks like a pen, but if you click a certain thing, .22 caliber bullet comes out of it, right? The informant told Strobel that Scallion was not shot by Dixon, but that he was shot by his own pen gun instead. When Strobel took this information to the police, they were apprehensive about wanting to do anything later with it. But later, they found out that the case had been reopened and then put in front of a grand jury to look at some new evidence. This seemingly airtight case was not as ironclad as people had thought. All right? So, why did the evidence point in the wrong direction? First thing was, witnesses saw this Dixon pounding on his door, on the girlfriend's door with his gun. The gun discharged before the police ever got to the scene. Proof that there was proof because there was a fresh bullet chip in the porch. All right? Secondly, Dixon did not want to get caught with the gun, so he hid it in the grass before the police arrived. Third, there was powder burns concentrated inside but not above the left pocket of the officer on his shirt. The bullet hole was at the bottom of the pocket. And contrary to the police report, it was found that the bullet's trajectory, in other words, the angle, had been a steep downward one. So it didn't come this way. If they'd have looked closer, it went like this. All right? It was below his pocket, and there was a bloody rip where the exit came out of the bottom of the pocket. Next one, Dixon's rap sheet. In other words, he had been on file as being a offender before in shooting someone. But the appellate court had freed him, finding that he was wrongly convicted, and the police had concealed this piece of key evidence in the court case. All right? And then finally, of course, Scallion, the policeman that had been shot, he was shot by his own gun of the same caliber, but never said anything because it was illegal in Illinois to have that kind of gun. So when we go back to these right here, how many of those ended up being true? Pretty much all of them, all right? But when you look at it on the surface, it looked like he did it, and he got convicted for it. Now, if people just wanted to, and some people will do this, if people just wanted to make sure that this guy was blamed for it because everything else was hidden, the policeman wouldn't have gotten in trouble for having the gun, wouldn't have gotten in trouble for lying, then they would have continued to hide that evidence. But luckily, the court system worked this time, and everything was overturned, and the guy got out free. All right. One more. There we go. Was there any real ironclad evidence against Dixon? No, there really wasn't. But it looked like it went that way. There was lots of examples of supposed evidence all strung together. But what everyone thought was true in this case just happened to be false. Instead, there was misleading theory, there was contaminated evidence, there was false evidence, people lied, etc. So, some lied, some presupposed what they wanted to believe, and others at the time just went along with the narrative because that's what everybody else thought was true. My question is, does this happen in other realms, like even in evolution? And one of the things I'm going to try to show over the next few weeks is, yes, it does. And it's huge, all right? And it took me years to come to grips with this, but I'm so convinced now that this is true. But if you speak this sometimes in public, people just think you're nuts, even though they don't know the science, and even though they don't know that they're believing a story that has been doctored for decades and decades, actually over a century now. When the basic premise is incorrect and the information is tainted, then the evidence ends up pointing in the wrong direction. Often someone with an agenda is picking and choosing which information to expose and which information is not going to be talked about. And that's where this book comes in, all right? Like I said, you can get all of this information outside this guy's book, and I did for a long time until I finally read this guy's book, and he lays it out very, very good. And actually, he's passed away now. He didn't die too long ago. But he has a second book out he put out before he died, and I can't remember the name of it right now. I think it's called Zombie Science, something like that. And I haven't got it because basically I already know what's in it, but I might get it just sometime just to read it. This is what he says. Now, to give you an idea, He has a PhD in molecular and cell biology, and he also now has and I don't remember which one came first, a doctorate in theology. But he was convinced, and he tells this in his beginning of his book, Icons of Evolution. He says that as he went through his undergraduate, bachelor's degree, master's degree in his cell biology, okay, he was pretty much led into that the evidence points in the direction that everybody says it does as far as evolution, and he was going along with it. But as he got to the PhD level, this is what I'm going to read here in a second, he found out that basically they weren't proving what they said they believed and what they wanted him to believe. This is how he states it. When I was attending Berkeley studying science, I believed most everything I read in my textbooks, and I believed that most of what was taught was substantially true. But as I was finishing my PhD in cell and developmental biology, I noticed that all of the textbooks dealing with evolutionary biology contained blatant misrepresentations. And that's what this book is about, those misrepresentations. Slowly, I discovered that Darwinism, as it is presented today, encourages distortions of the truth. The public was being systematically misinformed about the evidence for evolution. Later, he goes on to say that even most biologists are unaware of these problems. Most of what these scientists know about evolution does not come from actual research, but it is learned from biology textbooks, magazines, and TV. The same place that the general public is getting its information. Wells wrote his book to show that there's a small group of examples that are repeatedly given, even every time the topic is discussed by those that promote evolution. Yet these examples are either misleading or simply not true. We're going to discuss some of these over the next few weeks. But today, we're going to talk about peppered moths. Right? That's a biggie. You remember that? Did you ever see it in your, anybody ever seen that in their biology book? Have you for sure? Yeah? Okay. This is the truth behind the peppered moths. Right? When Darwin first wrote his Origin of Species, there was not a lot of evidence that natural selection was true. There has always been lots of cases where plants and animals were bred to make other plants and animals. Okay, so if you take an old English Terrier plus an old English Bulldog, you get a pit bull. All right, but that's not macroevolution. Remember the difference between macro and micro? Macro means that within a kind, you can change from one kind of dog to another kind of dog. But you can't change a dog into an elephant in macroevolution. Microevolution changes monkeys into man, amoebas into fish. All right? So microevolution is the thing that an evolutionist has a problem with, not macroevolution. Okay? It's important to have that distinction. If you take a red rose and a white rose and you blend them, you end up with a pink rose. All right. This is also done with our food supply. They take various kinds of wheat, they cross-pollinate them so that they can come up with a more robust kind of wheat. But they don't cross-pollinate wheat and roses and get a rose wheat. Right? They're two different kinds. But Darwin and others presumed, now that they knew what to look for, that they was only a matter of time before new discoveries would show that one species led to another, like a monkey to a man. In the 1950s, now Darwin is late 1960s, that's when, or 1860s, that's when evolution, his book was published. And it took a while for it to catch on. By the 1950s, there was a British biologist whose name was Kettlewell. All right, that's him right there. He's dead now. He lived into my time period. He did an experiment that seemed to be an example of what Darwin was looking for. Kettlewell's experiments suggested that predatory birds ate light-colored moths when they became more conspicuous on pollution-darkened tree trunks. So in other words, you got these two different, same kind of moth, but one of them's a lighter color, not quite light, and the other one's dark. Now, about the same time as he's doing this experiment, Industrial Revolution in England is at its height, okay, early 1950. And so for a long time, what has happened was that the trees were getting darkened in the area that he was doing the research by the industrial plants spewing out all their soot and stuff from the smokestacks. So his premise was that if the trees are darker, then the dark moths can hide easier than the white moths. Therefore, the birds should come in and eat more white moths, and therefore, natural selection, there should be more dark moths than white moths, light moths. That was his premise, and that's what he went on to try to show. To him, this meant that the dark-colored moths would survive and the light ones would not. Seemed like a good idea and a good example of natural selection. Then, in the late 1950s, anti-pollution laws were passed in England, all right? So in other words, factories had to start cleaning up their act, and so the trees were getting cleaner. As it rained, it would, wash the stuff off. The trees were not all that dark anymore. At that point, Kettlewell redid his experiment in the same spot, seemingly confirming his own results. But, now that was in the 1950s. By 1975, this would have been 25 years later. 25 years later, a famous geneticist, last name of Shepard, said this, 25 years later, the most spectacular evolutionary change ever witnessed and recorded by man. That's what he said about Kettlewell's moth experiment. In other words, it shows evolution. Another geneticist named Wright said that it was the clearest case in which conspicuous evolutionary process has ever been observed. This is during my lifetime. This is after I graduated from high school. I'm at the end of my college career, and they're still saying this. It seemed at the time that Kettlewell had come up with the kind of evidence that proved natural selection and therefore evolution. It was even published in the Scientific American. I don't know if you guys know what that magazine is, but it's extremely reputable. My dad used to have a pile of those. He loved to read Scientific American. I've read it a few times myself, but my dad loved it. After that, others began to try to replicate Kettlewell's experiment. His experiment was done all in the same place, and that was Dorset, England. But these next people tried to do it in some other places. All right, you can see 4 different places that they attempted in England to do the same experiment. This was a number of years after the fact. What happened was these experiments in these areas did not confirm Kettlewell's predictions. In other words, it didn't come up with the same results as what Kettlewell did with his original one. In fact, each of these 4 areas, and there were actually more than this, these were the initial 4 areas that they did after his experiment, each one of them had totally different results from each other. Not only different than from his, but different from each other. So, Kettlewell's research was being questioned by the 1970s and 1980s. Biologists began to realize that his research was too simple and probably not well correlated. In fact, a man named David Lees and some of his colleagues researched another 104 different sites throughout Britain and found that there was a huge lack of correlation when he ran, and all these other guys reran the experiment. Since 1980, evidence has accumulated that shows that peppered moths do not even rest on trees, which is how his original experiment started out. The important thing was that dark moths on dark tree trunks, had to be tree trunks, had photographs, were hidden, and the other ones were not, so that they would be eaten. But biologists now know, and this is a shot taken up, that those moths actually rest on the bottom of small branches. So where did he get his pictures? Well, I'm about ready to tell you that. An experiment by another guy, and I can't pronounce his name, last name is Mikkol, showed that these moths rested under horizontal branches. In fact, one researcher stated that in his 25 years of observation, he had only seen one of these kinds of moths ever naturally perch on a tree trunk. He'd been studying those same kind of moths for 25 years. But Kettlewall said his premise had to do with that tree trunk had to be dark to hide the dark ones. This gets worse. They also know now that birds don't eat these when they're setting on a tree. How do these birds actually catch their prey? Any guesses?
When they're flying around?
When they're flying. Yeah. Which makes doesn't that make it suspect also? If birds catch them flying around, then why would the trees have anything to do with it? Yeah. And there is another problem. If peppered moths do not rest on tree trunks, then where did Kettlewell's photographs come from? All right? Son of a gun. It seems, they know this now, that he manually positioned these onto the tree trunks. Dead ones were pinned or glued to the tree trunks, and live ones at a certain time of day, I think it's early morning when it is, if I read right, before they're still docile, you can put them wherever you want. And he did that, he took the photographs. Can you imagine? This is all known now. At the end of each chapter of Icons of Evolution, in other words, the guy's book that we just talked about, Jonathan Wells, as he gets done with each one of these icons, and this is one of his, that's in his book, Peppered Moths is one of the chapters in his book, he writes in the appendix a list of the biology books up to the time he published, which is around 2000, okay, way past 1950s, way past the 70s, way past the 80s, all right, where that particular icon of evolution is still in the textbooks, even though they know that it's nonsense. One of the books that Jonathan Wells cites on his chapter on peppered moths is a biology book called Biology by Sylvia Mader. Son of a gun. Found it. Okay? If you look on page 306 of this biology textbook, what do you see? It's still there. What happened when they found out that Scallion didn't do it? They let him out of prison, they got the cop in trouble, and they fixed it. What happened when they found out that the moth experiment that he did was bogus? They still put it in the textbooks. once you start seeing a few of these, you start wondering. Remember, can we prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that there's a God? No. Can we prove beyond the shadow of a doubt, though, that evolution is true? No. But we have to look at evidence. And to me, this is another important piece of evidence. And we're going to talk about some more of these that run on the same thing over the next few weeks. All right? I did a Google search. Everybody does a Google search. I like Google. Even though sometimes it gives you wrong information, which in this case I think it is. And this is what I put in to Google. Peppered moth shows evolution. And this is the first thing that came up. This is just like 4 days ago. Yes, the peppered moth is a well-known example of evolution by natural selection. The peppered moth's evolution is a classic example of how natural selection works in a changing environment. 1980, 2024. At this point, I find a lot of what they would say to be suspect, because if they really, really treasured there, they'd be looking for something else that would be better evidence, a better way to explain this, but not just simply using it, knowing it's wrong. Now, I find that there are other problems with this in the first place. In other words, even if they don't, but even if the bugs, the moths, got eaten off the tree trunks by the birds, I still don't think that that shows the kind of evolution that they're talking about. Why?
Because wouldn't the white ones then evolve so they're dark? So they don't get eaten?
That's a different way of looking at it than I thought, but I'm thinking of it more along the lines of what does his experiment actually show? Don't lose that train, because it's related to what I'm looking for. What does the experiment actually show? Goes back to what we talked about at the very beginning, and we talked about in some other classes so far. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say that there's variation in species. There's nothing special about it. Maybe I'm thinking about it.
No, that's another piece of the puzzle, but I think it's less important. I think we're still missing the point. Okay? What you guys are saying, neither one of you are wrong. You're both making correct statements. But it's bigger than that. Did white moths change into dark moths? They just got eaten.
Yeah.
They didn't change. They just got eaten. Okay? And we also, if they didn't get eaten and they changed, it was macroevolution, or microevolution, not macroevolution. There's still a moth. It's just a different color. But even that different color didn't evolve. The other one got eaten. So the whole thing, as far as I'm concerned, from the very beginning, doesn't prove anything along the lines of what they were trying to prove, even when they didn't know the information was false. Why did the scientists go along with it even from the beginning? Because they were so thirsty to find something that would show what they wanted to show. And there's lots and lots of these kinds of examples. I am going to show you a 4-minute video that kind of summarizes exactly what we talked about. So bear with me if I can bring this volume up just a little bit. Zoop. A lot of what I just said is in this video, but he's going to add a couple things I think are important, and it's good to hear it more than once.
I ever mentioned peppered moth as an example. It's been referred to gushingly by evolutionists as not only the poster child of Darwinian evolution, but also as the prize horse in our stable in terms of evidence of evolution via natural selection. As one evolutionist put it, it's the slam dunk of natural selection, The paradigmatic story that converts high school and college students to Darwin, the thundering left hook to the jaw of creationism. That is, of course, until all sorts of shenanigans surrounding how these studies and experiments involving the peppered moth were conducted was exposed in the book Melanism, Evolution in Action by fellow evolutionist Michael Majerus, a geneticist from Cambridge University. You see, the majority of the supposed proof of the evolution of the peppered moths was provided by Dr. Bernard Catterwell from Oxford University, who was so confident in his conclusions regarding the variation in moths driven by natural selection that he declared if Charles Darwin had only seen his experiments, he would have witnessed the consummation and confirmation of his life's work. That is, the confirmation of the story of evolution. And even though Catterwell's work had been known to be suspect for years prior, such as the discovery that he glued moths to tree trunks to get pictures of them where they don't rest naturally, Majerus's criticisms, likely because he was a fellow evolutionist, shook up the evolutionary community quite severely. Case in point, even vociferous atheist and anti-creationist Dr. Jerry Coyne, in a review of Majerus's book in the journal Nature, said the following after hearing the peppered moth example perhaps wasn't all it was originally cracked up to be. My own reaction resembles the dismay attending my discovery at the age of 6 that it was my father and not Santa who brought the presents on Christmas Eve. But wait a second, did Coyne truly understand evolution before this happened? Because all the peppered moth example ever accomplished was simply a demonstration of natural selection anyway, which isn't evolution in the big sense whatsoever. As mentioned previously, all it demonstrates is a reshuffling of genetic information that already existed. If you already had moths with various colors, and then certain environmental conditions favored certain colors over others, who really cares? As the British zoologist L. Harrison Matthews said in his introduction to the 1971 edition of Origin of Species, the experiments beautifully demonstrate natural selection, or survival of the fittest in action, but they do not show evolution in progress, for however the populations may alter in their content or light, intermediate, or dark forms, all the moths remain from beginning to end, Biston vetularia. You see, Matthews, a committed evolutionist, understood that if evolution were true, then at one time there were creatures without lungs, then lungs evolved. At one time there were creatures without wings, then wings evolved. There were creatures without echolocation, then that ability and all of its required genetic software and hardware, so to speak, evolved, etc. Evolution is supposed to explain where all the new stuff came from. Ultimately, evolution has to demonstrate where the acquisition of new abilities, forms, functions, and features came from. And these moths don't have anything new. So he understood that showing examples of a process that selects genetic information that's already in existence cannot be deemed evolution in action. And again, remember that the peppered moth has been touted as one of the best proofs of evolution. And here you have a renowned evolutionist admitting it's nothing of the sort.
Well, oh, you just had something on my mind I was gonna say, now I can't remember what it was. Because I'm old. I do that a lot. We're gonna, in the next few weeks, talk about more of these. I'm gonna start next week talking about fossils. And we're gonna spend 2, probably maybe even 3 weeks just on fossils. And I'm gonna do it in stages. I've been working and working and working. How am I gonna present this? Because there's so much information there. And I'm gonna want you to see both what they say about certain fossils in the past and more modern, because what we're gonna show in the first lesson next week is that the ones they had in the past are utter nonsense, okay? But they have new proofs now, and we're gonna get a little bit into those. We're gonna actually look at their words about them, and then we're gonna try to pick and see whether or not they actually show the evidence that they say they do, all right? And we're gonna see it from more than one person that is a well-known evolutionary doctor in biology. Actually, one of them is zoology. We're gonna hear it right from their mouths, all right? I think that's important because they're the most used ones nowadays, and they can be very confusing because they look like, on the surface, if you don't know what you're looking for, like they're telling the truth, all right? But I want you to keep in mind, what is the fundamental question that we said from the very beginning, and we kind of repeated it over and over again? What does it all come down to as to whether or not we tend to think the evidence points one way or the evidence points another way? Anybody remember?
Matter versus mind.
Yes, I'm very impressed that you could concisely say it and remember it at the same time. All right? Was there matter first? Was there mind first? Okay? Because none of this matters if matter, or the absence of anything that some people used to believe, I don't know if they still do now. I mean, how can it matter pop into existence when, we'll cover this later, I hope, when first and second law of thermodynamics says that matter can neither be created nor destroyed. All right? So if that's true, then you had to start with matter. All right? So we can't start with nothing. So it's either mindless matter like a rock or an ether gas or something, or it's a mind. And if it's a mind, that mind's a whole lot more powerful than we are. None of this matters anyway. Okay? Because yeah, all this stuff could really happen. Right? And we're going to kind of look at it that way. That's all I got today. I don't know if there's any questions or comments you guys have.
See, I brought up the tack and glue to our biology teacher before,
You already had known that? Good for you.
and he looked me in the eyes and said, "You are the only student to have ever known that. Why?" And I said, "I don't know."
I just said because I like to know when people are lying to me.
And I looked at him, I said, "It's the fact that I got curious, I looked into what we were gonna be studying, and I looked even further into it, because I didn't fully believe it." And he just looked at me and just in disbelief, he just said, "No one's ever looked into this even further."
That's what they're counting on.
Yeah.
Is that there isn't guys like you.
Yep, and then he's like, "Well, since Kale already knows, might as well tell everyone." And he told that entire class, and everyone just slowly looked at me, "How do you know this?"
Yeah, but did they change their minds?
A lot of them know, but that teacher, like, even after he looked into it even more, he started to.
So here's what it seems like, would have done. You took a piece of information, you planted it in an inquisitive person, and hopefully that will lead eventually down the road to more inquisitive. Maybe that guy's going to end up changing his mind eventually. Okay? You don't know. I applaud you for that. I do. Sometimes all you need is one spark of contrary evidence to change a whole life, but it takes time. What you're hearing from me isn't something I figured out in the last month or 2 years. This is something I've been working on since I was at least in my early 20s, probably late teens. I wanted to know. I got 20 books at home on this stuff that I've read over the years, and countless videos on my computer taking up gigabytes of space. But I found this time going through it that the arguments, even though they haven't fundamentally changed, they have gotten a little more complicated, and there's other things involved now that there wasn't when I was a lot younger. So for me, this has been good to re-put some of this together. I've taught it a lot over the years, but to re-put this together and include some of this newer information has been something I've enjoyed. All right.